The evening rain drizzled lightly, tapping against the windshield of Daniel's car. He sat motionless in the driver's seat, his fingers resting near his phone. His tired eyes stared at the screen, where an old, unread message from Emily still sat. It had been 3 years. 3 years since he had ignored her words. 3 years since he had walked away without looking back. And now, those 3 years felt heavier than ever. Outside, through the blurry window, he saw her. Emily. She was walking down the street, completely unaware of his presence. She looked different now. Stronger, more confident. The same woman he had once dismissed as too emotional was now the one who seemed untouched by the past. She smiled at something on her phone, her face glowing under the streetlights. Daniel felt his chest tighten. She wasn't supposed to be happy without him. She wasn't supposed to move on so easily. He had expected time to change things, to make her realize that he had been right to leave, that she had been wrong. But looking at her now, he wasn't so sure anymore. The weight of regret pressed against his ribs as a memory flashed through his mind. The last time they had spoken. The night he had pushed her away. He could still hear the rain that night, just like now. He could still see the way she had stood there, her eyes filled with questions, her voice shaking as she had begged him to listen. "Daniel, why are you doing this? What did I do wrong?" And he, blinded by anger and his own arrogance, had said words that now felt like poison in his throat. "You loved me too much, Emily." It was suffocating. How foolish he had been. He had mistaken devotion for weakness, love for desperation. And so he had turned his back on the one person who had never betrayed him, who had never once let him down. He had walked away, thinking it was the right decision. He had listened to the voices around him, his friends, his family, who had told him that Emily was too much, that she was holding him back. He had believed them. And now, as he watched her from behind a glass barrier of time and regret, he wished he hadn't. A sharp knock on his window jolted him out of his thoughts. It was his best friend, Tyler, leaning down with a smirk. "You all right, man? You look like you saw a ghost." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing a weak smile. "I'm fine," he lied, but as Tyler opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat, Daniel stole one last glance at Emily. She had disappeared into a cafe, her laughter still lingering in the air. It was in that moment he realized she wasn't the one trapped in the past. He was. Tyler leaned back in the passenger seat, stretching his arms as he glanced at Daniel, who still seemed lost in thought. The rain had picked up slightly, tapping harder against the windshield. Yet Daniel hadn't started the car. His grip on the steering wheel was tense, his jaw tight. Tyler sighed, recognizing that look. "You sure you're good? You've been weird lately," Tyler said, eyeing him carefully. Daniel inhaled sharply, forcing himself to look away from the cafe where Emily had disappeared moments ago. He didn't want to talk about it, but the weight in his chest was growing unbearable. The past wasn't something he had revisited in years, and now it was all he could think about. "I saw her," Daniel muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Tyler frowned. "Her?" Daniel nodded toward the cafe. "Emily!" For a second, Tyler didn't say anything. Then he let out a low whistle and shook his head. "Damn. It's been, what? 3 years?" 3 years, Daniel repeated, feeling the weight of every second that had passed since that night. Tyler exhaled loudly and tapped his fingers on the dashboard. "Look, man, don't take this the wrong way, but what did you expect?" She moved on. "You're the one who..." Daniel shot him a warning glance. "I know." Tyler held up his hands. "Just saying." "You were pretty damn cold to her. You didn't just leave, you destroyed her." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, his mind flashing back to the night he had let her go. Emily had stood in front of him, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the pendant he had given her on their first anniversary. It was a small, silver heart, something she had worn every single day since he had given it to her. But that night, her fingers trembled as she held it between them, her voice cracking. "If you walk away now, I won't chase you, Daniel." He had scoffed, too proud, too stubborn to acknowledge the pain in her voice. Good. That makes this easier. He had expected her to fight back, to scream, to beg. But she hadn't. She had just stood there, her eyes hollow, her fingers slowly unclasping the pendant from her neck. And then, in one quiet motion, she had placed it in his palm. "I hope you never regret this." And then she had walked away. Daniel's fingers twitched on the steering wheel as he snapped back to the present. Regret? That word was too small to describe what he felt now. He didn't just regret it, he was haunted by it. Tyler let out a slow breath, watching his friend struggle with thoughts he had buried for years. "You never told me why you really broke up with her," he said quietly. Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't know if he could say it out loud. He had convinced himself for so long that he had done the right thing, that Emily had loved him too much, that she had made him feel trapped. But now, after all this time, he was starting to see the truth. It wasn't her, Daniel finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was me." Tyler turned to him, eyebrows raised, waiting for him to continue. "I listened to everyone but her," Daniel continued, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter. "My friends, my family, they all said she was too much, that she was too emotional, too invested. They made me believe that love like hers was a weakness, and I was stupid enough to believe them." Tyler nodded slowly. "And now?" Daniel let out a humorless chuckle, running a hand through his hair. "Now, she's happy, and I'm the one stuck in the past." Tyler tapped the dashboard again, thinking. "You want to talk to her?" Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Did he? Would it even make a difference? She had moved on. He had seen it in her face, in the way she had laughed so effortlessly inside that cafe. She wasn't the same girl who had once stood in the rain, begging him to see her worth. And yet, something inside him burned with the need to know if she had really let go, to know if there was even the smallest part of her that still remembered. He looked toward the cafe, his heart pounding. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I do." Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears as he pushed open the car door. The cool night air hit him instantly, mixed with the soft scent of rain on pavement. He hesitated for a moment, his breath uneven, his fingers clenching at his sides. He hadn't seen Emily in years, not up close, not like this. And yet, here he was, standing outside the cafe she had just entered, feeling like a man on the edge of something irreversible. Tyler leaned out of the car window, watching him with a knowing smirk. "You sure about this, man? You can still turn around." Daniel shot him a glare but said nothing. Turning around wasn't an option. Not anymore. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, pushing open the glass door. The warm air of the cafe wrapped around him instantly, carrying the rich scent of coffee and fresh pastries. It was cozy inside, with dim lighting that gave everything a soft golden glow. A few people sat at their tables, lost in quiet conversations or the glow of their laptop screens. And then he saw her. Emily sat near the window, her fingers curled around a white coffee mug, her head tilted slightly as she laughed at something. Across from her sat a man, someone Daniel had never seen before. He was leaning in slightly, his gaze fixed on her, his smile easy, comfortable, the kind of smile Daniel had once given her. Something in his chest twisted painfully. Emily looked different. Not just in appearance, though she had changed in subtle ways. Her hair was a little shorter, styled differently, and she carried herself with an air of quiet confidence he didn't remember. But it was more than that. She looked at peace, like she had healed. Daniel suddenly felt like an intruder in a world that had already moved on without him. For a second, he considered turning around, walking right out of the cafe and pretending he had never stepped inside. But before he could make that decision, Emily looked up. Their eyes met. For the briefest moment, time stood still. Her smile faded, her fingers tightening slightly around her coffee cup. He couldn't read her expression. Was it surprise? Annoyance? Indifference? It was impossible to tell, but she didn't look away. Daniel swallowed hard and forced himself to step forward. His heart pounded against his ribs with each movement, but he kept going until he stood just a few feet away from her table. Emily blinked, recovering quickly. She placed her mug down gently, her face unreadable. "Daniel," she said, her voice smooth but distant. He almost flinched at how neutral she sounded. "Hey," he managed, his voice lower than he intended. He glanced at the man sitting across from her, who was now looking at him with mild curiosity. Emily followed his gaze, then turned back to Daniel. "This is Ryan," she said simply, gesturing to her companion. Ryan leaned back in his chair, offering a polite nod. "Hey, man." Daniel forced a nod in return, though his stomach churned. He didn't know why, but he hated that Emily had moved on so effortlessly. It was one thing to assume she had forgotten about him. It was another to see it with his own eyes. There was an awkward pause before Emily lifted an eyebrow. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" It was a fair question, but he wasn't sure how to answer it. He had spent 3 years convincing himself he had made the right decision, and yet here he was, standing in front of her, uninvited, unsure of what he even wanted to say. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I saw you, and He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I just wanted to say hi." Emily studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. Though it wasn't the smile he remembered. It wasn't warm. It wasn't inviting. It was polite, distant. "Hi," she said. Daniel's stomach twisted. She was treating him like a stranger, like someone she had once known in another lifetime but had long since left behind. Before he could say anything else, Ryan shifted in his seat. "We were actually just about to leave," he said, looking at Emily. "Do you still want to grab dessert?" Emily nodded, already reaching for her coat. "Yeah, that sounds good." Daniel's throat tightened as he watched her casually gather her things. Just like that, she was leaving. No hesitation, no lingering looks, no indication that seeing him had meant anything to her. He had been fooling himself. She really thoroughly had moved on. Emily stood, slipping her coat over her shoulders, and looked at Daniel one last time. There was no bitterness in her gaze, no resentment, and somehow that made it worse. "It was nice seeing you again," she said. And then, without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked past him, stepping out into the rainy night with Ryan by her side. Daniel stood there, frozen, as the cafe door swung shut behind her. "Nice. Seeing you again." The words echoed in his mind, settling like lead in his chest. He had spent years convincing himself that she had been the problem, that she had loved too much, that she had been suffocating, that leaving her was the best decision he had ever made. But as he stood there, alone, watching her disappear into the night, he realized the truth. She hadn't been the problem. She had been the best thing that had ever happened to him. And now, she was gone. The night stretched on, and Daniel found himself driving aimlessly through the quiet streets, the rain blurring the glow of streetlights as they passed by. Tyler had long since left, leaving him alone with his thoughts, which were now an endless loop of memories he had tried to forget. His hands were tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched as he tried to push them away. But they kept coming back, uninvited. The first time he had met Emily, how she had laughed at his terrible joke even when no one else did. The way she used to light up whenever she talked about something she loved. The way she had loved him, completely, unconditionally, without hesitation. And the way he had thrown it all away. He had convinced himself for years that he had been right to leave, that Emily had been too much, that her love had been overwhelming. But now, looking back, he saw things differently. It hadn't been her that had been too much. It had been him who hadn't known how to accept something real. A sharp pain twisted in his chest as another memory surfaced, the night it had all fallen apart. He could still see her standing in the rain, her hands shaking as she clutched the pendant he had given her. Her voice had cracked as she had asked the one question that had haunted him ever since. "Why? Why are you doing this?" And what had he said to her? "You love me too much, Emily. It's suffocating." How arrogant, how cruel. He had been so sure back then, so convinced that love like hers was a weakness, something that would hold him down. But now, after all this time, he finally understood the truth. Her love hadn't been suffocating. It had been the purest thing he had ever known, and he had destroyed it. Daniel let out a shaky breath, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wanted to go back. He wanted to undo it all. He wanted to shake his past self and tell him to open his eyes, to see what he had before it was too late. But it was too late. He had spent 3 years thinking that if he ever saw Emily again, he would still see traces of the girl he had left behind, that she would still carry pieces of him with her, that she would still, in some small way, be his. But tonight had shattered that illusion. She had moved on, and he hadn't. Daniel pulled the car over to the side of the road, running a hand over his face. The weight of his mistakes was crushing, suffocating in a way that he had never expected. Emily had been right all along. She hadn't chased him, and she never would. For the first time, Daniel was forced to accept a truth he had spent years avoiding. He had lost her, not just for now, not just for a little while, but forever. And that realization hurt more than anything. Daniel sat in his parked car for what felt like hours, watching the rain trickle down the windshield, blurring the city lights beyond. The streets were nearly empty now, save for the occasional car passing by, but he barely noticed. His mind was a mess, drowning in thoughts he couldn't escape. He had lost her, not in the way people lose touch after a breakup, not in the way exes sometimes reconnect after years apart. No, this was different. This was permanent. Emily had moved on, truly moved on. And the worst part, she hadn't hesitated. She hadn't stuttered when she said his name. She hadn't looked at him like she was reliving the past. There had been no sadness in her eyes, no resentment, no regret, only indifference. That was what tore him apart the most. When he had left her, he had convinced himself that she would never forget him, that no matter how much time passed, no matter what changed, he would always be a part of her, a wound she carried just beneath the surface. He had believed that if they ever crossed paths again, he would still have some hold over her, but tonight had proved him wrong. He had been nothing more than a stranger to her, a face from the past, someone she had once known, once loved, but no longer thought about. She had looked at him the same way she might look at an old classmate from high school, someone whose name she remembered but whose presence no longer held any weight. That realization made something inside him crumble. He ran a hand down his face, his fingers trembling slightly. He had thought that seeing her would bring him closure, that after all these years, he would be able to look at her and feel justified in his decision. But instead, all he felt was a hollow, aching emptiness that he hadn't expected. He had made the biggest mistake of his life, and there was no undoing it. His phone buzzed against the dashboard, snapping him out of his thoughts. He blinked, rubbing his tired eyes before glancing at the screen. It was a message from Tyler. Tyler, dude, don't do anything stupid. Daniel let out a breath, shaking his head. He wasn't going to do anything stupid. What was there to do? Emily was gone. She wasn't coming back. She didn't want to come back. And that was his fault. He leaned his head against the seat, exhaling shakily. He wanted to tell himself that he was fine, that he could move on just like she had. But deep down, he knew the truth. She had moved on because she had no choice. He had given her no choice. And now, she was happy. Without him. The thought made his stomach twist painfully. He remembered the way she used to look at him, like he was her whole world. He remembered how she used to leave little notes in his apartment, things as simple as, "Hope today is good to you," or "Don't forget to eat." He remembered how she used to grab his hand without thinking, how she always noticed when something was wrong before he even said a word. She had loved him in a way that no one else ever had, and he had convinced himself that love like that was suffocating. Now, he would have given anything to feel it again. His mind flashed back to the cafe, to the way she had laughed at something Ryan had said, the way she had effortlessly picked up her coat and walked out without looking back. That image burned into him like a scar. She was done with him. Completely. Finally. Daniel let out a shaky breath, gripping the steering wheel as the rain poured harder. For 3 years, he had thought she was the one who had been left behind. But now, he understood. He was the one who had been left in the past, and no matter how much he wished otherwise, there was no going back. The rain had slowed to a quiet drizzle, but the weight pressing down on Daniel's chest hadn't lifted. If anything, it had only grown heavier. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his fingers ached, but it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The realization that Emily had truly moved on wasn't just painful, it was suffocating. For 3 years, he had been convincing himself that she was the one who had needed to change, that she had been the one who loved too much, who wanted too much, that her emotions had been a burden he hadn't been ready to carry. But now, sitting here alone with nothing but regret for company, he saw the truth for what it was. It hadn't been Emily who needed to change. It had been him. He had been the one who had been afraid of being loved so completely, afraid of being needed, afraid of being vulnerable in a way he hadn't been ready to accept. And so, he had destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to him. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. How had he been so blind? How had he let go of someone who had loved him in ways most people could only dream of? And why had he spent 3 years pretending he didn't care? His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Another message from Tyler. Tyler, seriously, man, don't do something you'll regret. Regret. The word hit harder than it should have. Because the truth was, he had already done something he regretted. He had already made the biggest mistake of his life. And now, he was living with the consequences. His thoughts spiraled, memories flooding back faster than he could process them. Emily, standing in his kitchen, barefoot, wearing his hoodie that had swallowed her small frame, her laughter filling the air as she danced to some old song playing on the radio. Emily, waiting for him outside his office in the freezing cold, because she had wanted to surprise him with his favourite coffee after a long day. Emily, sitting on his couch, eyes bright with excitement as she talked about the book she had just finished, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. Emily, looking up at him with love in her eyes, love so deep and unwavering that it terrified him. And then, Emily, standing in the rain, her face pale, her voice trembling. "If you walk away now, I won't chase you, Daniel." God, how he wished she had chased him. He wished she had fought for him, had held on tighter, had refused to let him go. Because maybe if she had, he wouldn't be sitting here, drowning in regret so deep he could barely breathe. But she hadn't. She had loved him enough to let him go. And that had been his final test. The moment that had determined everything. He had wanted her to beg, to plead, to prove that he was worth fighting for. But Emily had understood something back then that he was only realising now. Love wasn't about begging. Love wasn't about proving someone's worth. Love was about knowing when to let go. And she had let go. Completely. Daniel let out a sharp breath, his throat tight. He could feel the sting of unshed tears, but he refused to let them fall. What was the point? Tears wouldn't change anything. Tears wouldn't bring her back. She had made her peace with the past, and now he had to do the same. But how did you make peace with something when you were the reason it had fallen apart? How did you move on when you knew, without a doubt, that you had lost the only person who had ever truly loved you? His grip on the steering wheel loosened, and for a long moment he just sat there, staring blankly at the empty street ahead. There was no fixing this, no going back, no second chances. He had left her once, and now she had left him too. The difference was, she had found happiness in his absence, and he had found nothing but emptiness. The silence in the car felt heavier than the night itself. Daniel sat there, motionless, staring at nothing in particular. His mind was stuck in an endless cycle of regret, replaying moments he had once taken for granted. It was strange. He had never considered himself the kind of man who lived in the past. He had always moved forward, never allowing himself to dwell on things he couldn't change. But tonight, he realised he had been fooling himself, because he had been stuck in the past. For 3 years, he had convinced himself that leaving Emily had been the right decision, that he had done them both a favour, that she had needed to calm down, to stop loving so hard, to become less. But tonight had shattered that delusion. Emily hadn't needed to change. He had. And now it was too late. A sharp knock on the window startled him. Daniel blinked, turning his head, only to see Tyler standing outside, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, rain droplets glistening in his hair. Daniel hadn't even heard him approach. With a sigh, he unlocked the door, and Tyler slid into the passenger seat. He didn't speak right away, just sat there, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The sound of the heater humming filled the space between them. Finally, Tyler let out a breath. "I figured you'd still be here?" Daniel didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. Tyler studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "You look like hell, man." Daniel let out a dry chuckle, though there was no amusement in it. "Feels about right." Tyler leaned back in the seat, stretching his legs out. "So what now?" That was the question, wasn't it? What now? What did a man do after realising he had destroyed the only good thing in his life? What did he do after learning that the person he had once meant everything to no longer thought of him at all? Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know." Tyler was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, I was talking to Lauren the other day." Daniel glanced at him. "And?" "She still talks to Emily sometimes." Tyler shrugged. She mentioned something a while back. Said Emily never once spoke badly about you after the breakup. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? I mean, she never trashed you, never blamed you, never sat around complaining about how you broke her heart. She just moved on. Daniel's chest tightened. That was worse than if Emily had hated him. Hatred meant she still cared, at least in some way. But indifference? That meant she had wiped him from her heart completely. He swallowed hard. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Tyler sighed. Look, man, I've been your friend for a long time, and I never said much about what happened with Emily because, well, I figured you needed to figure it out yourself. But now I got to ask, do you finally get it? Daniel clenched his jaw. Get what? Tyler turned to him fully, his gaze steady. That you were the one who lost something, not her. Daniel's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, but he said nothing. Because Tyler was right. Emily hadn't lost anything. She had gained freedom. She had gained peace. She had found love again with someone who didn't take her for granted. But Daniel? He had lost everything. And the worst part? It was his own damn fault. Tyler exhaled and leaned his head back against the seat. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you to move on or whatever. That's up to you. But I will say this. If you ever get another chance, don't screw it up. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. There's not going to be another chance. Tyler was quiet for a long moment before he finally said, maybe that's the real punishment. Daniel looked over at him sharply, but Tyler was already opening the car door, stepping back into the cold drizzle outside. He didn't wait for a reply. He just gave Daniel one last look, one that said, think about it, and then walked off into the night. Daniel sat there, his best friend's words circling in his head. Maybe that's the real punishment. Maybe it was. Maybe the real punishment wasn't losing Emily in one sudden moment. It was living every single day knowing he had let her go. Knowing that he had been given something rare, something precious, something people spent their whole lives searching for, and he had destroyed it with his own hands. The rain picked up again, heavier this time, and Daniel leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. Maybe Tyler was right. Maybe this was the real punishment. And maybe he deserved it. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He had tried, laying in bed, staring at the ceiling, hoping exhaustion would take over, but his mind refused to quiet. His thoughts kept circling back to Emily, to the cafe, to the way she had smiled as if the past had never touched her. As if he had never touched her. The realization gnawed at him, sinking deep into his bones. It wasn't fair. Not that she had moved on. That part he could understand, even if it hurt. But what made his stomach twist was the fact that she had healed while he was still here, haunted by the past. She had let go so effortlessly, and yet, for him, it was like trying to swim with weights tied to his chest. How? How had she done it? The question followed him through the early hours of the morning as he sat by the window, watching the rain drip down the glass. His apartment felt empty, too quiet, like the walls were closing in on him. 3 years. 3 years since he had told her she was too much. 3 years since she had walked away without looking back. 3 years since he had convinced himself that he was right, that letting go of her was a sign of maturity, of control. But looking at himself now, sitting alone in an apartment that felt more like a cage, he realized something. Emily hadn't been the one who was too much. She'd simply loved in a way that was whole, fearless, and unguarded. And he had been the one who had been too little, too afraid, too distant, too unwilling to accept the love she had so freely given. That truth sat heavy in his chest, a weight he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. His phone buzzed on the table. For a second, hope flickered in his chest. A stupid, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, it was Emily. But of course, it wasn't. It was Tyler. Tyler, you up? Daniel stared at the message for a moment before sighing and replying. Daniel, yeah. The response was instant. Tyler, figured. Come outside. Daniel frowned. Outside, he glanced at the clock. 4:47 a.m. What the hell was Tyler doing here? Still, he grabbed his jacket and slipped on his shoes, stepping into the cold morning air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a damp chill that clung to the streets. Tyler was leaning against his car, hand shoved into his pockets, looking entirely too awake for someone who had sent a text before dawn. Daniel narrowed his eyes. What are you doing here? Tyler shrugged. Felt like you needed to get out of your own head. Daniel let out a dry laugh. You got me out of bed for that? Tyler raised an eyebrow. Did you actually sleep? Daniel didn't answer. Tyler smirked. Yeah, didn't think so. With a sigh, Daniel leaned against the car beside him, rubbing his hands together for warmth. So what? Are we just standing here in the cold for fun? Nah, Tyler said casually. We're going for a drive. Daniel frowned. A drive? Where? You'll see. Before Daniel could argue, Tyler was already getting into the driver's seat, starting the engine. Daniel hesitated, but there was something about the way Tyler had shown up, unannounced, no explanations, that told him there was a reason behind it. With a sigh, he climbed into the passenger seat, closing the door behind him. The streets were quiet as Tyler drove, the sky still dark but tinged with the first hints of morning. They didn't speak for a while, just let the silence stretch between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but Daniel could feel that Tyler was waiting. For what? He wasn't sure. Finally, after a few minutes, Tyler spoke. You know, I used to think you had it all figured out, he said, his tone casual, but edged with something deeper. Back when you and Emily were together, I thought, damn, this guy's got it made. You had someone who actually loved you, someone who gave a damn. Daniel stared out the window, his jaw tightening. He didn't respond. Tyler continued. And then, when you let her go, I kept waiting for you to realize what you'd done. But you never did. You just moved on like it was nothing. At least, that's what you made it look like. Daniel exhaled sharply. It wasn't nothing. Tyler shot him a glance. Yeah, I know that now. Daniel clenched his fists. So what? Is this some kind of lecture? I already know I screwed up, Tyler. Tyler shook his head. Nah, not a lecture. Just, I think you need to stop lying to yourself. Daniel frowned. About what? Tyler sighed. About why you left her. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Tyler kept going. You told everyone she was too much, that she loved too hard, that she wanted too much from you. He let out a humorless chuckle. But that wasn't the truth, was it? Daniel swallowed, staring at his hands. Tyler didn't wait for an answer. The truth is, she wasn't too much. You were too scared. Daniel's chest tightened, but he still said nothing. Tyler sighed. You know what Lauren told me once? After you broke up with Emily? Daniel shook his head. She said Emily didn't cry for long, Tyler continued. Said she grieved, sure, but she didn't stay broken. She picked herself up. She grew from it. And you? You did the opposite. Daniel clenched his jaw. That's not true. Tyler just looked at him. Isn't it? Daniel turned away, staring out the window, but the words cut deep. Because they were true. Emily had healed. She had moved forward, found happiness, learned how to love again. But Daniel? Daniel had spent 3 years pretending he didn't care, burying himself in distractions, convincing himself that leaving her had been the right thing. But now, stripped of all his excuses, all his justifications, he could finally see the truth. He had been running from something he had never really wanted to let go of. And now, he was paying the price. Tyler pulled the car over, putting it in park. Daniel frowned. They were at some empty overlook, a wide stretch of road that led to nothing but darkness and city lights in the distance. Daniel turned to him. "Why'd you bring me here?" Tyler cut the engine and leaned back in his seat. "Because you need to make a decision, man." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "What decision?" Tyler exhaled. "You either accept that she's gone, move on and actually mean it this time, or you figure out how to live with the regret." Daniel swallowed hard. "Either way," Tyler said, "you stop pretending like it doesn't matter." Daniel stared ahead, his heart pounding, because for the first time he understood, really understood, what he had done. And no matter which choice he made, one thing was clear: he would never be the same again. The silence inside the car stretched long, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on the distant city lights, his thoughts an unrelenting storm inside his head. The truth was, he didn't know how to move on. He didn't know how to let go of the regret clawing at him, or how to make peace with the fact that Emily was gone. Not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, in every way that mattered. For 3 years, he had told himself he didn't need closure. He had been the one to leave. He had been the one to decide that she wasn't what he wanted, that she was too much. But now, sitting here with Tyler's words still circling in his head, he realized something else. He had needed her to be too much, because if she was the problem, then he didn't have to face the truth about himself. If she had loved too hard, it meant he hadn't been too afraid. If she had been suffocating, it meant he hadn't been the coward who pushed away the best thing that had ever happened to him. But now, the illusion was gone. Emily had been exactly as she was supposed to be, wholehearted, fearless in love and endlessly devoted. She had given him something rare, something real, and he had been the one who wasn't enough. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His fingers trembled slightly, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "You ever regret something so much it physically hurts?" Tyler didn't answer right away. He sat quietly, watching the distant city skyline with the same thoughtful expression he always had when he was choosing his words carefully. "Yeah," he said finally, "but at some point, you have to decide whether you're going to let it eat you alive or learn from it." Daniel let out a humorless chuckle. "And how exactly am I supposed to learn from this?" Tyler shrugged. "By making sure you don't make the same mistake again." Daniel scoffed. "You mean by not screwing up the next good thing I find?" Tyler turned to him, his expression unreadable. "I mean by not lying to yourself the next time you have something worth holding on to." Daniel clenched his jaw. "It won't be the same." "No," Tyler admitted, it won't." That was the worst part. No one would ever be Emily. No one would love him the way she had. Not because other people weren't capable of love, but because no one would ever be her. No one would ever look at him the way she had, as if he was something worth believing in, something worth holding on to, even when he didn't deserve it. And now, that love was gone. Forever. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he murmured almost to himself. Tyler nodded. "I know." Daniel shook his head. "I really thought I'd look at her tonight and feel nothing. I thought I'd see her and just be glad we went our separate ways." Tyler didn't respond. He didn't need to. Daniel swallowed hard. "But I didn't feel nothing." He let out a broken laugh. "I felt everything. The air inside the car was thick, heavy with the weight of his confession. Tyler let out a slow breath. So, what now? Daniel stared ahead, his heart pounding. That was the question, wasn't it? What now? What did a man do when he realized, too late, that he had let go of the only thing that had ever truly mattered? He could reach out to her, try to fix it, try to tell her everything he should have said all those years ago. But what good would that do? She was happy now. She had moved forward, built a new life, found someone else. What right did he have to show up and shake that foundation just because he was still drowning in his own mistakes? He clenched his fists, exhaling sharply. He hesitated, forcing himself to say the words. I think I have to let her go. Tyler nodded slowly. Yeah, I think you do. Daniel closed his eyes. He had been holding on to the past for so long, pretending he had made peace with it when, in reality, it had been eating away at him all along. But tonight had made it clear. Emily didn't belong in his past. She belonged in her future, and he wasn't a part of it. For the first time, he allowed himself to accept that. The regret would always be there, lingering in the background of his life like a shadow. But he couldn't change what had already been done. All he could do now was learn to live with it. He turned to Tyler, managing a small, tired smile. Thanks for this. Tyler smirked. What, ruining your night? Any time, man. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Nah, just thanks. Tyler nodded, understanding the weight behind the words. Daniel exhaled one last time, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off the past. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in 3 years, he was finally ready to try. The drive back felt different. The weight in Daniel's chest was still there, but it had shifted, less suffocating, more bearable. It wasn't closure, not entirely. Closure would have been Emily walking back into his life, telling him she still loved him, giving him a second chance. But that wasn't reality. Reality was this: the road stretching ahead, the past behind him, and the undeniable truth that he had to keep moving forward, even if it hurt. Tyler drove in silence for a while, letting Daniel process everything. The soft hum of the engine and the distant sounds of the city were the only things filling the quiet. It was almost peaceful. Finally, Tyler spoke. You know, for what it's worth, I don't think she ever hated you. Daniel stared out the window, his fingers tracing absent patterns against his knee. That almost makes it worse. Tyler nodded. Yeah, I get that. Because if Emily had hated him, it would have meant she had held on to something, anger, pain, resentment. But instead, she had simply let go. She had chosen to move on without carrying the weight of what he had done to her. Meanwhile, he had spent 3 years pretending he was fine, only to realize, far too late, that he wasn't. It was strange. For so long, he had believed that leaving her had been an act of strength, that cutting ties and walking away had been proof that he was in control. But now, sitting here, he saw the truth. Emily had been the strong one all along. She had loved without fear, given herself fully, and when it was clear that he didn't want what she had to offer, she had walked away with grace. She hadn't begged, she hadn't chased, she had simply accepted, and that, more than anything, was what set them apart. He had been the one to run from love, and she had been the one to embrace it. And because of that, she had found happiness, and he had found regret. Daniel let out a long breath. You think it ever stops hurting? Tyler glanced at him. What? The regret? Tyler was quiet for a moment, as if considering his answer. Then, with a sigh, he said, I think it fades, but it never really goes away. Daniel nodded slowly. That sounded about right. There were some mistakes you just had to live with, and this, losing Emily, was one of them. The city lights grew brighter as they approached Daniel's apartment. Tyler pulled up to the curb, shifting into park but not turning off the engine. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel before speaking again. "So, you good?" Daniel let out a short laugh. "Not even close," Tyler smirked. "Figured. But you're better than you were an hour ago." Daniel thought about that. Was he? Maybe. Not because the pain was gone, not because the regret had magically disappeared, but because, for the first time, he wasn't lying to himself. For 3 years, he had buried his emotions, convinced himself that he had made the right choice. He had ignored the small voice in the back of his mind that had always whispered, "You made a mistake." But now there was no more running, no more pretending. He had lost her, and he had to live with it. And somehow, accepting that made it easier to breathe. Daniel reached for the door handle, then hesitated. "Hey, Tyler." "Yeah?" A small, tired smile tugged at Daniel's lips. "Thanks for everything." Tyler grinned. "Anytime, man." Daniel nodded and stepped out into the cool night air. As he walked toward his building, he felt something shift inside him. The ache was still there, the regret still burned, but it no longer felt like it was suffocating him. It was just there, a part of him, a reminder of what he had, of what he lost, of what he would never take for granted again. He glanced up at the dark sky, letting out one last breath before stepping inside. Tomorrow, the world would keep turning, and for the first time in 3 years, he was finally ready to turn with it. Thank you all for listening to this story with our channel. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe to motivate us to bring more interesting stories. Much love to all of you.